All right. Hello and welcome back, everybody, to the final session of the conference. We're closing out with 3 exciting keynote speakers, and then we will conclude with some closing remarks. Next speaker up is going to be Matt Taddy, who is a professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, currently on leave to work as a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. He has a PhD in applied mathematics and statistics obtained in 2008 from UC Santa Cruz. And he was a fellow at the Computation Institute at the University of Chicago, as well as a research fellow at eBay. Taddy developed and teaches big data classes at the Business School of University of Chicago, an advanced MBA course designed to prepare students for careers on the interface between business and data science. The title of his talk is going to be Economic AI, and I'm looking very much forward to it.
Thank you, Marcus. All right, so thank you very much to the organizers. This conference is a little bit outside of my usual network, and I've had just a really fantastic time. So I really appreciate it. For the people that I do know here, often at computational social science events, I talk about some sort of text as data subject. I'm going to use a little bit of text as data today in a toy example, but that's not the main gist of the talk. I will just mention on that because take advantage of the audience. Matt Jenskow, Brian Kelly, and myself have a draft survey out of text as data, really geared towards getting more economists involved here. So if anybody you want to give that a quick read, we would very much appreciate feedback from the field, from experts like yourselves who are used to working across these interdisciplinary lines. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to talk about economic AI, right? What is that? One of the advantages of AI is that nobody really knows what it means. You just get to define it however you want, however's convenient. And so for today, I'm going to talk about AI as breaking complex systemic questions into simple sets of prediction tasks. And the subtext there is that these are simple texts of tasks that can be attacked with off-the-shelf arbitrary machine learning. Okay? So that's the theme. Let's back it up a little bit and say, you know, what do economists do, and why would I try to make any of that artificial? So way back, economists have, and they still do, think about systems, right? So any social scientist here is thinking about system. That's what makes it social science instead of just social looking at stuff, right? And economists are especially proud of this type of thing, and they've built, really codified a whole language of systems that we work with. So these are some very basic demand systems that you might see in an introductory textbook. There's a classic table from, the Almost Ideal Demand System paper. Okay, now, that's what economists do. The big question that I've had from a lot of people, especially in this audience, and I don't know if there's that many economists here, I don't think there are, is why have the economists been so resistant to the sort of machine learning techniques and these ideas, whereas political science has jumped all over them, social science, sociology has jumped all over them, okay? And I think the big resistance has been that perhaps more than the other fields, maybe rightly or wrongly on that statement, but they certainly feel that they attach more value to causal inference, to careful causal inference, right? And causation is this kind of up and down, loosey-goosey philosophical concept, but really what they're saying there is they don't think the sort of just machine learning exploratory approach to things is going to get at enough of the systems that they're studying in order for it to be economically useful. So they've really been chugging along, doing structural work, matching up that structural work with data in the standard econometric causal inference way. So what are economists being asked to do now, right? So these are all pictures from Microsoft examples, but I've worked with economists at several firms, large tech firms, and they're being asked to answer standard economic questions at a ridiculous scale, right? So things like, what price should I set? What's my competitor going to do if I enter in this way? How should this contract be structured? These are basic economic things, but you're asking them over hundreds of thousands of products with input that includes images of products. You're asking this where you have longitudinal clickstream data, all sorts of data on your people. And you're being asked to do it over and over and over again, right? So companies like Microsoft, like Amazon, employ many, many economists because there's this massive need for economic labor, okay? And even with that, there's just not enough PhD economists out there to satisfy all of the things that need to be done. And we're seeing this in academia as well, right? If you look at the economics job market these days, you'll see people coming out in labor economics or microeconomics, and you'll see a lot of these people, 80% of their thesis is focused on measurement issues, right? Rather than thinking about the economic theory involved or thinking about, how they might tell a narrative of why this stuff actually matters. And the reason for that is just the weight of the data, the difficulty of the data processing that they're having to deal with using their old methods is pushing everything else out of the way, okay? So we have an interesting labor issue. So when I talk about applied economics or applied econometrics, and I talk about this world of, like I said, I'm seeing job candidates, young researchers who are not able to do economics anymore. They're just basically working on measuring stuff and repeating fairly basic economic observations. There's a few different ways that this works. There's the best way, which is via experimentation, right? So if we want to run experiments, if we can run experiments, that's obviously the best way to get at some sort of causal point. So the example, you want to know the impact of sponsored search ads on revenue. The problem is, of course, that search ads are targeted towards things that people, or they are shown when we think people are going to click on them anyways, because those people are already looking for the product. And so what you do is you do an A/B test, and maybe you turn on ads or turn off ads randomly, and then that tells you, okay, here's the real causal effect of advertisement because the ads were randomized. It was an experiment, so I know this is a valid causal effect. The problem with experimentation, I guess they're expensive and they're politically difficult to run for big and long experiments. The long one is especially important, right? So even when now I'm in a world and industry where people are very comfortable with experimentation, they're not comfortable with experiments that take a year when you need an answer in a month, right? And also, there's still a lot of labor that goes into analyzing the result of an experiment. But you should experiment if you can. Here's the classic, I don't know how many people have read Josh Angrist's Mostly Harmless Econometrics book. This style of econometric analysis has been hugely influential. It's summed up as the sort of method of instrumental variables, if you know what that is. And the idea is you look for things that are almost experiments, or experiments but are not directly related to your treatment of interest out there in the world, and do your causal inference on the basis of that randomization. So what's the impact of going to a charter school on your college success? What's the confounding issue, the reason we can't just measure charter school, college, and see what the correlation is? Well, students who go to charter schools, well, maybe they're there because their parents pushed them or their parents lined up forever. They're different from the students that didn't go to charter schools before they went to charter school, right? That's a selection bias issue. And so what you would do is you would have some sort of a experiment in the allocation of access to charter schools. It's common in the United States to have lotteries, and your ranking in that lottery dictates what position you have in line in order to go to the charter school. And so you could look at the college success of people that randomly scored high on that lottery versus people that scored low on that lottery, okay? That's the mostly harmless instrumental variables type of econometrics. The limitations of this, I think, are pretty serious and not well recognized from the academic side. It requires a high level of sophistication and a lot of luck. And, you know, that's fine. That's more the labor-intensive side of things. The other issue is that in many cases, especially in academia, these examples are too cute. And what I mean by that is it's not that every school district out there does randomized lotteries in order to figure out who goes to what charter school. It's always it's only the most forward-thinking, typically wealthier school districts that are doing these lotteries. Other school districts just need charter, or they're just taking whatever and putting kids wherever, right? And so what we're getting, and that's just one example, what we're getting when we seek out these funny little instrumental variable setups are really funny, potentially funny, corners of the space of treatment effects, and we're going to then try to generalize that treatment effect that we've learned for this funny little example onto the entire segment of population affected, and that transformation, or that transfer might not be valid. So I think there's a bit of a crisis of external validity there. I'm not going to be able to solve that today, but I'll at least be able to make things faster. And here's probably the most common type of applied econometrics, which is, I guess, in contrast to the mostly harmless. This is the hazardous one. And this is where you have a bunch of, you don't have any experiment, but you have a bunch of observable variables that you can control for, right? So this is your standard stats 101. You want to control for something, you just throw it in your regression. What is the sensitivity of consumers to prices? In other words, I want to know the demand curve. Well, the problem is that prices are set in response to consumer demand, right? Hotels are expensive at Christmas and they're sold out. It's not that hotels are sold out because they're expensive, but rather the prices and the sales are moving together in response to holiday demand. And the idea is you compare transactions that match on observables in some way, right? So these look like the same demand setting, same day of the year, same type of hotel, same whatever, okay? Except randomly the prices were different. Okay? So this is a side of matching style. So anybody who's seen propensity scores, things like that, that's all this sort of slightly hazardous econometrics. Okay? Here the issue is very much a labor and a subjectivity thing. So selection of the control variables, the things that you want to match on, there's going to be way too many control variables out there. Potentially you want to include as many as possible, but of course you can't include everything if you're just doing dinky little ordinary least squares or something like that. And so you spend months or weeks, if you're really fast, picking out the variables and carefully tuning things until you get your p-values to look nice, right? So that's problematic. Okay, so that's my intro spiel, which took 15 minutes. The basic idea of the talk today, and it's going to be high level, is that machine learning can automate and accelerate tasks in each of these applied econometric workflows. Okay, so I'm not going to improve the state of econometrics here other than making it faster, automating it, and freeing up economists to think about more interesting questions rather than spending all of their time trying to find the cutest little instruments. Okay, so here's an example from that mostly harmless style. So short-term price sensitivity. If I drop my price by 1%, what percent will quantity sold increase? For example, -3 means that if I increase my price by 1%, my sales drop by 3%. Confounding issue, both prices and sales respond to underlying demand. So you can't just do a machine learning regression for sales onto prices. You'll get crazy things like upward sloping demand curves, right? Where if you charge more, people buy more. So what we want is a causal effect and not their co-movement, because their co-movement gives us the wrong answer. So here's an example. I don't actually price beer for a living at Microsoft. They don't sell beer. But here's a little example, and you can grab the data off my website if you want to run through it. So the idea here is I have a bunch of beer transactions from a store in Seattle. And I would like to understand the consumer elasticity, the consumer price sensitivity. And for reasons that are fairly straightforward, but I'm not going to go into it, if you regress the log number of units sold onto the log price, the regression coefficient is interpretable as that price sensitivity. Okay, so a -3 means that price goes up by 1, sales go down by 3%. Okay, price goes up by 1%, sales down by 3%. Okay, so two things here. If you just do log units sold onto log price, in other words, all beer brands are exactly the same, you just look at this co-movement thing. For reasons that I mentioned before, because of the confounding, you get a way too tiny elasticity. If you haven't seen these before, you don't know that this is tiny, but anything less than 1 doesn't make any sense. People would be charging a lot more money, or at least consistently less than 1, less than -1, doesn't make any sense between -1 and 0. If you try and get a separate elasticity for every beer brand, in other words, you do the standard stats thing, and you throw them a dummy variable for the beer brands, then you get elasticities that look like this. Why is that? Because there's lots of transactions. This is a month of transactions, so millions of transactions, but over hundreds of thousands of different beer brands, many of them. So the data is very sparse. You don't have enough information. So this says, for example, that sales go up by 150% if you raise price by 1%, right? That's total garbage. As is the stuff down on that end. Nobody's that price sensitive for beer. So the problem is, okay, just from a pure stats side, we need to group the products together using brand, package, et cetera, things like that. Here's the text as data bit. I could have done that or written a script to do that, but because I'm lazy, what I did is I just tokenized, I just parsed the descriptions of the beer, right? And then I used the words in those descriptions as variables, right? So just counts 1 if that word is in there, if the word Budweiser in there, 2 if the word, or 1 if the word IPA is in there, things like that. So then I'm going to have a regression model. Instead of being a different elasticity, for every individual beer brand, we're going to have an elasticity that depends upon the presence or absence of the words in the description for that beer. Okay? Very basic text as data type strategy. Okay. Now I have a lot of parameters though, right? There's a lot of words used to describe beers. Now I, in fact, have more parameters than I have number of observations. How am I going to fit this thing? The obvious stats trick would be just to throw it all in a lasso. And that doesn't work, okay? That doesn't work. You mostly get stuff still between -1 and 0, right? And the question, why does that not work? Is because this is not a pure prediction problem, right? The statistical model that's going to do the best job predicting sales from a combination of beer descriptions and prices is not necessarily the best model for understanding and isolating the causal effect of price on sales. Okay? I'll explain why that is in a second, but the basic idea here is that the naive machine learning is conflating two problems. Okay? There's two problems here, both of them difficult and high dimensional. One is selecting the control variables that you need to make sure are included in your regression. The second one is predicting the response conditional on those controls. These are both tough statistical learning problems, okay? And they're things that we're right now just squishing together, and that's what doesn't work. There's a really nice and actually fairly old literature on what you need to do to fix this scenario, okay? So what you actually do is you try to ignore what it says there in terms of, if you know what the conditional score is, you just estimate nuisance functions that are orthogonal to the treatment effect in its conditional score. What this actually means is you have a function where the prices, your treatment, are a function of those covariates, those controls. And then you also have a function where the sales depend on the prices and those controls. And so you treat the dependence of the prices on those covariates, on the words, as a nuisance function. You estimate that thing first, you take the residuals of the prices, and then you use the residuals of the prices in order to predict the response. Okay? So just to give credit, I'll work through it in more detail. Just to give credit where this is due, this is based on ideas in this Chernozukov et al. Paper, but it goes back all the way to Jerzy Neyman in the 70s. Okay, so more intuitively, we have a model where both prices P and sales Y depend upon these high-dimensional covariates. The steps are as follows. You predict prices from the demand variables. You predict sales from the demand variables. Okay? That's going to give you some P hats and some Y hats. And then what you do is you take the regression residuals for the sales and regress those onto the residuals for the prices. To put this in sort of like common sense language, what you're doing is you're finding what's surprising about the sales and what's surprising about the prices, and you're taking the surprising bits onto the surprising bits. So even though you didn't have an experiment, you're creating an experiment here. Okay? And so now these two steps, those first two steps up there, now those are arbitrary prediction tasks. So what we've done is we've taken a problem that was a tough causal inference problem, and we've broken it up into two simple prediction tasks. You can fit a random forest to this. We use deep neural networks. You can use whatever you want, right, in order to do these things. And that frees you up to put whatever you want into X as well. You can have images, you can have text, you have whatever you want. Okay? So that's the kind of the basic idea. One thing I'll mention, because Justin mentioned it yesterday, I just added this on here. Data splitting, which he mentioned was a really good idea, is just in general a fantastic idea that in industry we use a ton, but I don't think in academia it's used enough. And what I would do here is I would maybe estimate my two nuisance functions, how price depends on those variables and how sales depends upon those variables on one data set, and then take another data set to estimate the final regression of residuals on residuals. Okay? And academics might, you might freak out and say, hey, what about my power? I don't have enough sample size. Turns out, really simple, if you do it twice, so you do that once and you get your estimates, then you make the auxiliary sample the other one, you switch these, now you estimate the residuals on this, and you do the final regression on there, then you average your results, and your efficiency is then on the same order. Okay? So use data splitting more often. And I can elaborate on that if anybody wants to chat about it. And then when you run this thing with the beer again, you can go check out the code. If you're curious about that, now you finally get reasonable elasticities, things that live mostly between -1 and -6, which is the range we expect, and then we actually do experimental validation afterwards. Not for the beer, but for stuff that we actually sell. Okay? So that's and the text encodes a natural hierarchy, things like that. Okay? That's what econometricians do. This might seem fairly straightforward, right? But my point that I'm trying to make today is not that complicated. It's about getting ML into economics. Economists and econometricians are very good at breaking down the problem into a bunch of things that look like just pure prediction problems. Now, previously, they weren't hitting those with machine learning. They were hitting them with something like ordinary least squares, which led to the massive labor shortage, right? But if you're an economist or a econometrician or you're exposed to that literature, go back to it and say wherever they're talking about measurable equations and they're slotting in ordinary least squares, you can now just slot in arbitrary machine learning, right? It's the same idea. You're breaking down a causal question, a structural question, into a series of very simple prediction tasks. And so very briefly, I'll touch on the another one that we're looking at. Instrumental variables. If you don't know what it is, you probably are not going to know from this, but the basic idea is that you have some weird world where you want to understand your treatment effect on Y, but there's outside omitted variables, confounders, getting in the way of your relationship here. But what you have out there is some source of randomization in your treatment variable, and because of that source of randomization, you can do causal inference. There's all sorts of stories about instrumental variables. To me, the place where they work is when it's what I call upstream randomization. You can think about this as an intent to treat type setup. So if you're in a medical trial and they have, say you have some drug that you want to get people to take as a treatment, you randomize access to that drug. You can't force people to take the drug, right? So if the drug is painful to take in some way, particularly if it's painful to take if your disease status is better or worse or something like that, okay, then you're going to have a trouble where you randomized access, but the actual treatment and the taking of the drug was not randomized, right? The randomization of access there is an instrumental variable. Okay? And you can use these techniques in order to recover what the actual effect of treatment was rather than the effect of randomization of access to treatment. Okay? So that's what I call upstream randomization. If you've seen instrumental variables, you've seen two-stage least squares where you first regress the price variable onto the instrument, and then you take the fitted treatment the expected value of the price, which is going to be my z tau hat, and you regress y onto that instead of onto the original price. Again, if you hadn't seen IV before, I probably didn't teach it to you there. Okay, so here's just the other idea, though. The instrumental variables problem or setup implies this top line here, which is that the expected value of your response, given your covariates and your instruments, is equal to the structural problem of interest, G given P and X is our true causal function, integrated over the conditional distribution for that treatment variable given those covariates. Okay? This implies a loss function, right? So this implies very generally a loss function where I need to minimize, choose this function to minimize this whole thing here, where this guy here is any estimate of the conditional distribution for the treatment variable in those instrument and the covariance. Okay? Again, the point I'm making is nothing radically new. This is normally where the economists would diverge and look at various least squares methods for approximating this thing. And the mentality I'm trying to drill into people is, no, we can fit these things directly because we have ability to do that. I can go out there and I can fit a density mixture network or some sort of deep net in order to get that conditional distribution. I can then go out there conditional on that, you know, just take derivatives with respect to this and minimize that loss function, again, using some sort of deep neural network representation for that function there. Okay? And so that's what we do. We just take these things that are implied by old school econometrics, and instead of using ordinary least squares, we hit them with deep nets. What is a deep neural network? I think I only have like a minute left, so I'll just say very quickly, lots of connections, lots of nodes. Everybody's heard of them. There's a ton of hype about them. Really what they are is just fast and cheap. There's no magic to them. I won't talk about it. Well, for the econometricians in the room, if there's any, deep nets are not non-parametric. There's a real misconception that they are. They're semi-parametric because they involve a massive dimension reduction at the first layer. We could use these things for I don't want to go into the example in detail, but basically we can use these things for all sorts of causal inference setups, the most compelling of which are when we have images of products, right? So, or images of whatever. So let's talk about a price setting. We might have the price sensitivity depends upon the image of the beer label, right? So what we can do is we can use that image as input to the deep neural net if there's been any sort of upstream randomization. And I'm not going to talk about the example because I don't have any time. So what I'm just going to say, just to finish off, and I'm happy to follow up on any of this, the idea of this talk today is certainly not radical, right? All I'm trying to say is that the machine learning doesn't create any new insights. It doesn't create any sort of replacement or automatic economist. But what it does is you can take the sort of structural econ, nice reduced form econometrics that you're already doing. Same thing applies in social science. Find the things that are just pure prediction tasks, and instead of working hard to optimize those, outsource those to some sort of machine learning. Okay? The other thing I'll say is that instrumental variables are everywhere inside firms because we're always randomizing, but not the right things. For social scientists, I added this one slide here. Again, there's a ton of hype about deep learning. I don't know if it's kind of sort of met this community yet or if people are using these tools yet. Deep learning is very good, low human cogs or low development cost off-the-shelf machine learning. It is, again, not magic, right? It's very expensive in terms of computation time. It's very expensive in terms of like energy. We're heating up the globe with all the deep nets that we're fitting. But it is very cheap in terms of researcher time. This stuff is just very fast to prototype. And that is its value. Okay? Anything else where you see where people are like, deep nets are magic, they're going to figure this out, that's total garbage, right? Deep nets are fast and cheap, and they work on lots of various different things. So the reason that that's really cool is that the next big thing is going to be not how do we improve the machine learning, which is really the industry right now at NIPS and ICML and things like that. It's shifting to how do we combine these machine learning tasks together to do better AI, and that's going to be all about combining the deep nets with the domain expertise, which is what I was trying to do here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions. Yes, Taha.
Thank you very much. It's probably a very naive question. Just to check if I got it correctly, where you looked at the regressional correlation between residuals of y and p predicted based on x.
Yeah.
Is that true that it only works if x is big enough subset of all the independent parameters that would influence both y and p?
Yeah, so in these demand, there's an answer, a stats answer, but then there's an answer that's specific to the economics. So I'll give that one because that fits the talk. In a demand system, I only need to know variables that the price setter was aware of that they use to influence their price setting function, right? So effectively, you can think of that residualization stage as me training a learner that mimics the price setter, okay, or the multitude of price setters. So that's going to be a very reasonable assumption when I'm on the firm side. So either I'm partnering with the firm doing the pricing, or I'm at the firm doing the pricing, because I will be able to get access to the data that went into the price setting rules. That's going to be unreasonable if you're not on the firm side. Yeah.
Yes, Jeff?
Thanks, Matt. Fantastic. Very simple question. I'm interested in concretely how the ML takes care of all the work that the economists were having to do before. So in the beer example, is it now that the economist doesn't have to look through all the potential features that might be driving price, and that's what the ML is doing? Or so what is ML taking over from the economist?
Yeah, so that's it. So the workflow in that particular example would have been going through and carefully including or excluding, feature combining, building up a hierarchy of things that they think went into the pricing. This ties into my previous answer. The economist would have to essentially learn the pricing rule. And they would have to learn the sales side function, those sort of patterns as well. The ML is just doing what ML does. It feature learns and does that automatically for you, right? And this is a point with the deep net stuff, is so often let me put it this way. In many settings, the answer a deep net gets right away is not going to be as good as what somebody who knows the problem, hand coding, feature building, would have achieved in a month. But it's going to be pretty good, and it's going to happen in an afternoon, right? So that's the real benefit here. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? If that's not the case, thanks again, Matt, for your talk. And we'll move on to our second talk, given by María Pereda, who is a postdoc, a complex systems researcher at University Carlos de Madrid. She did her PhD in process systems engineering, and I'm going to get the pronunciation certainly wrong, at University of Valladolid. Yes, in March 2014. She did a first postdoc at University of Burgos.
Burgos? Yeah.
And research interests are very interdisciplinary. She focuses on complex systems and emergent phenomena. She applies methods from simulation, game theory, machine learning, and others. The title of the talk is Learning to be Nice, Social Norm as a Result of Adjusting Expectations. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Hi. Hi. I am Maria. I guess this picture is familiar to all of you, the hat from The Little Prince. But did you see that coming? It's all about expectations. In fact, this work is about expectations. The idea of this work comes from a previous work of my colleagues in which they assessed people's expectations of generosity in a series of control experiments using the dictator game. The dictator game is a game in experimental economics in which we have two players that are going to meet just once. We have player one, the dictator, has to determine how to split an endowment, such as a cash prize, between herself and the second player, the recipient. The second player simply receives the quantity the dictator gives to her and cannot make any claim. She has a passive role. The theory of self-centered preferences predict that the dictator keeps all the money and the recipient receives nothing. So any positive donation can be interpreted as a proof of generosity. Coming back to the previous work of my colleagues, in which they assessed people's expectations of generosity, they found that indeed people expect generosity. This is the distribution of guesses of donations in different treatments And moreover, aspirations and donations, what people guess to receive and what they donate, are very aligned. Moreover, in the meta-study of Engel of 616 dictator games shows that people donate sizable amounts of the pie, with a non-trivial fraction of individuals donating an equal split. So, one of the main mechanisms of such ultra-cooperative behavior of humankind is expectations, which promote prosocial behavior through the willingness to fit in the group, to conform to the expectations the other has about oneself, and to avoid punishment. Thus, expectations with drive behavior become social norms. In fact, according to Vickery, social norms are governed by both empirical expectations, what we believe others will do, and normative expectations, what we believe others will believe we will do. Moreover, when facing other humans, interacting with them, we don't expect them to behave randomly. We expect their actions will conform to the expectations we have for that context. So, social norms and expectations grease the wheel of social integration. In this work, we model the formation of people's expectations in terms of learning from our own experience. We want to understand the role of expectations in the dictator game. So we built a model. I'm going to explain the model with a comic. This is Bob. This is Alice. They both have aspirations. Aspirations are the quantity that they want to gain in any interaction. Bob's aspirations are 2 out of 4, and Alice 1 out of 4. Bob is going to play as a dictator, so he is endowed with a bag of candy. The endowment is 1, and according to his aspiration, he is going to donate a quantity to Alice, the recipient. So Alice is going to receive 2 candies. So Alice's payoff is 2 candies. And with this payoff, according to... Alice is going to receive an stimuli. Since the quantity she received is higher than what she had as an aspiration, she received a positive stimuli. So with this stimuli, through a process of learning, Alice is going to update the quantity she is going to aspire the next time. So Alice's aspirations are updated to be higher because the stimulus is positive. Moreover, with the payoff, also Alice is going to update the strategy she is going to play when playing as a dictator. The strategy is the quantity she is willing to donate. So through a process of habituation, of herding, using this equation, she will update the donation. But with equations 1 to 3, we have the basic dynamics of the model, but we don't have a feedback from aspirations to donations. So we need to introduce a further ingredient. So we developed this equation 4 that simply says that donations are going to be bounded by aspirations, are going to be at most the quantity resulting from subtracting oneself aspirations from the endowment. So when I receive the endowment, I keep what I want, and then I donate a part of the rest. So with these equations, Alice also updates the quantity she is willing to donate when playing as a dictator. Then, when playing as a dictator, taking into account the aspirations, she will donate. And in this case, Bibi receives 2 candies. his aspirations are 3 out of 4. So he is going to receive a negative stimulus that is going to make that his aspiration will be smaller than before, and so on and so forth. So in the model, we will have 1,000 individuals interacting that will be paired in random pairs, and roles, dictator or recipient, will be assigned randomly. They will play a dictator game, and after the game, as a result of the game, the recipients will update their strategy, the donation, and also their aspirations. So now I'm going to present experimental results of the model. We want to compare these experimental results with, the simulation results with the experimental results in the literature. This first model, we call it a deterministic model. We are going to, to set the endowment to 1. Aspirations are going to be initialized following a uniform distribution, and donations bounded by initial aspirations. And we will explore the space of parameters of the learning algorithm. In the figures that I'm going to show, they will be like compositions of distributions of donations in blue and aspirations in red for a LH parameterization. As a first result, we can see that the population, the agents have converged to donate non-zero quantities and quantities around 30% of the pie, and also to expect to receive 30% of the pie. We don't find any individuals behaving selfishly. Interpreting our results on expectations in terms of social norm, we find a notable adherence to such a norm, since all individuals ended up donating quantities very similar. These results are in general agreement with experimental results, since the average is quite similar. The average of the Engelmet study is around 28% of the pie. But we find a discrepancy in terms of heterogeneity of the distributions, since experiments with humans have a certain degree of variability in the distributions of guesses and donations. In order to include, to take account this variability, we include imperfect decision making, or as it is referred to in economics, trembling hand, allowing agents to make imperfect decisions, feeling more or less generous, make rounding errors, etc. We implement this by adding a noise term to the donations. Our results in this respect are that for low values of the noise term, results are quite similar to the deterministic model. But when this noise term is higher, we find distributions of donations and aspirations very similar to the ones we find in experiments. In some of the parameterization, even we find some people donating 0, as in real experiments with humans. And in general, the average of their donations and aspirations is in excellent agreement with the average found by Engel, which is his average is 28 and our around 27, and also in terms of heterogeneity. We measure heterogeneity with the Gini coefficient. In search for more general results of robustness of our model, now we are going to test two things. The first one is our model robust against envious people? In this part, we want to see what happens if in the populations we introduce people that we never donate more than half of the pie because they are averse to inequity distributions. So we introduce a percentage of the population behaving like this. What we have is that with a probability of 5%, a person will behave like this, we won't donate more than half of the pie. Here we have the average results for the previous models, the deterministic one, stochastic with error noise term high. And then we test the introduction of these inequity averse individuals in both models. What we see is that the results are quite similar, but the distributions are a little bit skewed to the left, suggesting that the whole population has become somewhat more selfish. The second test to the model is we try what happens if we introduce in the populations free riders. Free riders are going to be individuals that will always donate zero and they won't change their donations and aspirations because they don't follow the social norm. Our results in this respect are quite dramatic because we find that the introduction or just one single free rider is able to destroy the social norms, and almost all individuals ended up donating zero and expecting zero. So the social norm changes from being generous to being completely selfish. This suggests that expectations are fragile, and we need to be constantly updating our expectations to accurately predict what others are going to do. The conclusions of this work, we have presented a simple model that is able to explain how people behave in dictator games, introducing the idea that donations are guided by expectations. Moreover, this mechanism affects both our donations, which are affected by the quantities we receive, and our expectations that also reflects the quantity we receive. Moreover, expectations affect donations by imposing an upper bound to the quantities we are willing to donate, leading to a coupled evolution of both dynamics. And these results are in excellent agreement with the experimental observations. Our model is based on reinforcement learning dynamics, which are also successful in explaining results from other experiments, such as Prisoner's Dilemma, public good games, and also the Moody conditional cooperator behavioral rule. This suggests that this could be a mechanism used by us humans in many situations. Our main message is that learning may explain the emergence and adherence to a social norm in the society. The fact that most people expect generosity may be indeed a consequence of this type of mechanism having been in action through history. But we cannot forget that expectations are fragile. The observation of people going against the norm can have awful consequences, as also Milena showed in his gamification work this morning. So, in order to sustain our society, we need to behave. Have you learned to be nice? Now I want to thank to my collaborators, Pablo Grañas Garza, Ismael Rodríguez Lara, and Ancho Sánchez. And if you want to read more about the work, you can find it here. It's in press now. The original title of the work is The Emergence of Altruism as a Social Norm. And before ending, just a little bit of propaganda. We are engaged in a FET-Open project called Ibsen, From Individual Behavior to the Socio-Technical Man, which aims to conduct large-scale experiments For that aim, we have a pool of subjects of around 23,000 volunteers, and we have also developed a platform for conducting this kind of large-scale experiments online and also in lab, and it also supports the configuration of relationships of individuals through networks. So if you want to know more about it or just collaborate, drop a mail to both Ansho or me, or visit our website. And lastly, I want to thank the organization for inviting me and you for being here listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have time for a couple of questions.
No seas tímido.
Yes, one in the very back.
Thank you for the talk, very interesting. I was wondering if you thought about introducing some guys in the population who always donate something. So basically, because let's say that you have this capitalistic ideology, strict capitalistic ideology, but I would like to see also some, and see what happens in between.
I'm very happy you asked me this question, because one of the reviewers of the paper just suggested that, and we test individuals in the population that do not update the donations, but just always donate the same, like 25% or 50% or whatever. And what it happens is the distribution of donations shifts to have the mean around the quantity these people is donating. And it happens with very few individuals. So it's quite interesting that individuals, not just free riders, so individuals that not follow the norm, drives of the whole population to what they are doing. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have any empirical experiment based on the real people and find out whether what parameter that you set up is can explain the population or the society? Any real experiment on people, and then maybe you can infer which parameter in the model that fit?
Yeah, in fact we have results from experiments with people playing the dictator game. And in our model, we find that the cases with higher habituation parameter, these ones, are the ones that are closer to the empirical results. But I don't think we can derive a conclusion of that people use age, for example, age with a value of 0.8 in real life.
And are there any network assumption on your?
No, they are paired in pairs randomly, but they are only playing once against the other, and then change. Thank you.
All right, another question over there.
Thank you for your work. I've been looking for something like Otree, so I'm really, really excited to see that it exists. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I'm also wondering what, I think it's really nice that you've sort of shown the evolution of cooperation here empirically through a simple model. I'm wondering what this means for the assumptions behind things like the dictator game, in the sense that I believe that the graph of results from the dictator game, like from that meta-analysis, that's usually from sort of one-off dictator games, so that it's not things where people know that they're in a repeated game. Whereas it feels like you're sort of showing that you could get those results if all of life is a repeated game, and people can't actually divorce their assumptions from the rest of life when they go into an artificial environment like a one-off dictator game. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
here we are supposing that this kind of mechanism of learning has occurred during history, so we as humans have like something pre-code that makes us to be altruism. But in experiment, I could expect that if we have people playing repeated dictator games, they will learn somehow, and results I expect to be different from one-shot results. Thank you.
Okay, with that, let's thank Maria again.
Thank you.
And we are moving on to the final keynote of today and to the final keynote of the conference. I'm happy to welcome Jeff Hancock, who is a professor of communication at Stanford University. He did his PhD in psychology at Dalhousie University, Canada. And before joining Stanford in 2015, he was a professor of information science and communication at Cornell. He's the presenter of a widely popular TED Talk, and his main research interests are psychology of social media using techniques from computational linguistics and behavioral experiments. And I'm looking forward to hear more about that in the talk.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here. Marcus, thanks for an amazing conference. It's nice to be last because I can comment on how great everybody's been. And I appreciate you all for still being here. Today we're going to talk about something that I think computational social science has ignored, and I know I certainly did. And the basic idea here is that we draw on a lot of data that come from computational systems that play a role in people's social lives. It's why all these data are interesting to us. So everything from online dating to analyzing the Twitter news feed, we're interested in how people behave using these systems. But one thing that we don't really know very much about is how people think or reason about those systems and whether that affects the way that they use them or not. And so if we're going to make inferences about social science based on these data, it's also important for us to understand how people think about the systems that they're using. It has another part to it too, which I'm going to use as my starting point, which is it also gets to the ethics of doing computational social science. And what I mean here is that we need to understand what people think is going on in these sort of systems in order to not violate expectations. As Maria pointed out, it's all about expectations when we're trying to think about doing ethical work at scale with computational social science. So let me start off with a study that I did with Facebook. I had a huge worldwide negative reaction to this paper. A very interesting experience to spend, a month reading emails from around the world about how horrible a person you are. I've recovered. My psychologist tells me I'm doing okay. So most of you are familiar with this. Basic idea is Facebook manipulated people's news feeds to examine how the absence of emotions in the news feed could change the way they ended up producing emotional posts, to look at whether emotions spread through a network in a contagious type way, so you feel happier when you see your friends happy, or in a social comparison sort of framework, which is when I see my friends being happy, it makes me sad. The paper concludes that it's more of a contagious type model. But what I'm going to talk about today is how we violated basically people's expectations. And one of the reasons for that is we didn't have a good idea about how people think about something like the news feed. Okay? And one of the unique things about being part of this project is that I received a lot of mail. Let's call it what it was, hate mail. And I received almost 1,000 emails. And I wanted to know more, so like a good social scientist, I've analyzed those emails. And what I want to do is try to say, like, what were users trying to tell me? So there were a lot of academics wrote me. I'm going to set them aside. Lawyers, politicians, they wrote as well, but I'm going to set them aside. And I'm going to show you the results of a sort of content analysis of the remaining emails, which were the users, okay? And the number one theme of all the emails that I received were usually involved more swear words, but how dare you manipulate my newsfeed? Okay, and this is very common. People were like, how dare you interfere with my newsfeed? Like, to them, the newsfeed was like a social window, right? A window into their world. And this idea that the newsfeed could be manipulated was just completely unfathomable to them, or just made no sense. And of course, Facebook played a role in this. Facebook, for a long time, it had stopped by the time the study came out, was calling itself a platform. And platforms don't manipulate people, right? Neither do Windows. Okay. Another one that came out was how important the newsfeed is in a lot of people's lives. So this is an example. My friend's dad just passed away. If I was in this experiment, I'd never have known, right? And so they were very upset that something that's deeply important to them was being manipulated. And this goes against a lot of what I think the popular press calls social media, which is sort of trivial and meaningless. My experience from these emails is that that's definitely not the case. Okay, so the news feed and other feeds like them are quite important. A third was that emotions are distinctly important. I think here's where we violated some sense of autonomy. People wrote frequently about, like, hey, these are my emotions, this is my mind, this is me, you can't mess with that. And the last is sort of like a paradox of doing big data research. So I've done a lot of studies, many of them get presented in the media. I'd never had these kind of questions. I want to know if I was in your experiment. Because it was large enough that, you know, potentially could have been in that. Whereas most of our work in psychology and in communication, they've been done at a university, so some students, like on a campus, it happened to them, and I can learn from that. But here, we're potentially learning from something that I was in. So big data is sort of paradoxically personal, potentially personal. So this is the users, and as I said, the really big theme that came through was that first one about being manipulated. And so I was curious, is this just for the users? No, we looked at the media. We could take all of the articles over the 6 months after the controversy came out and say, okay, it's about a Facebook research study, and it's either our study or some other study, and we can compare the language of them. And we looked at a couple of things that tell us about whether surprise is being experienced. This is a very simple sort of summary of the data, but basically you can see that when journalists were writing about the article, about this study, they used more first-person singular than they were writing about other Facebook studies, and they used more anxiety terms as well. And this is consistent with linguistic expressions of surprise. We can look at the academy. So how did other scholars write about it? So we looked at about 6 months after. There were about 120 citations. And we can see even academics are using more first-person singular in the abstracts and more anxiety terms. So this is looking at people that cited the Facebook study and either were writing about ethical aspects or the scientific aspects. And they were about half and half. And you can see that even academics were expressing some linguistic surprise. So to me, that means that we violated a lot of expectations. I mean, I think there's many reasons why this study became controversial, and probably if we ran the simulation of life again, 1,000 times, only some percentage of them would it have been controversial, and some other study would have received all that attention. But clearly in our case, we violated people's expectations. Other issues, of course, were people being completely unaware of the algorithmic aspects of the feed. Informed consent was a really big issue, and happy to talk with people offline about that issue, and that it was personal. But really looking across all these different sort of reactions to the study, it's about expectation violation. Okay? And this got us sort of thinking about how do people think about these systems. And there's a really great literature in children development, cognition, anthropology, referring to folk theories. And this is what we've been thinking about a lot. Folk theories are basically how we think about complex systems. We tend to be unaware of how we think about them, so they're sort of intuitive and implicit. We don't really explicitly think about them, and they're intuitive. So Matt and I yesterday were talking about our kids and how dumb they are when they're first born, and they sort of like develop some folk theories as the time goes on. So they'll initially walk right off a stage or walk into a deep pool of water, because they have no concept that there's gravity, right? Over time, their understanding of gravity evolves to the point where recently my 6-year-old daughter asked me how gravity works. I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. Got to tell my daughter how gravity works, and it went horrible. She asked how gravity works. I'm like, well, there's big things, and they have mass, and they attract smaller things to them. And she's like, okay, great. Why? And you know where this goes. After about 3 whys, I was in deep trouble. And it turns out that if I asked anybody in here, including the physicist that talked about it earlier, or mentioned he was a physicist, after about 5 or 6 whys, most people don't know how gravity actually works and would have a difficult time describing, what the gravitational coefficient is, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, all of us are here and alive today, right? So we actually have a very good understanding for our current purposes of how gravity works. That is, we have a folk theory of how gravity works. So when we think about computational systems, we see something that's similarly complex. Take the Facebook newsfeed as the example. It's not only massively engineered to the point where most people can't understand how a system like that works, massive amounts of data, really advanced machine learning, but also it's being plugged into a massive social system. It receives billions of social inputs on a daily basis. So it's incredibly complex, and people, we argue, must have some sort of folk theory as they engage with it, much like they have a folk theory about, say, gravity or toilets or zippers, all of which, by the way, we have folk theories for, and most people perform really poorly at saying how exactly a toilet works. So the point there is not that we're dumb. In fact, we're not. We just use it really well enough for what we need to do. Toilets just take care of business. And we don't have to go into depth for it, right? So that's the key thing here. Folk theories are not about people being dumb. It's about them having a good enough understanding for what they want to accomplish. Our argument is that we just have no idea what people think about when they interact through systems with other people. And there's tons of these kind of systems now, not only Facebook and Twitter, but online dating, Uber. Vast numbers of systems play a role in our social lives now. So what is it that people think goes on in that black box, which is itself sort of a folk theory, right? A metaphor, that allows them to understand how the social behaviors of others are seen and how their social behavior may be seen by others. So to look at this, we wanted to come up with a method to develop this. And a couple of colleagues have developed their own ways, primarily through interviewing people and asking them and trying to surface these folk theories. And we wanted to come up with another method that allowed us to look at many, many more people. So for example, some colleagues at Illinois did a really nice study with 40 people doing interviews and came up with these really fascinating theories about how people think that it works. And the vast majority of those people at the beginning of the study had no idea that there was any algorithm involved, right? Which gets to this sort of expectation idea. For us, we're gonna take a different approach. We're gonna use metaphors. And metaphors are really useful because they allow us to sort of tap into unspoken ideas that people have by allowing them to just use a metaphor that captures some of the qualities of what their folk theory is without having to, explicitly articulate it. And so here we have previous work out of cognition that says metaphors are a good way of getting these folk theories. Metaphors are really common in tech, so, to pitch your company, you think of another company that's similar to, so like Pi is the Uber for pizza delivery, Bannerman is the Uber for security, Law Trades is the Uber for lawyers. Metaphors are really good for helping other people understand what it is at the core of what you're trying to, do or say. So here's our method. It's this idea. I'm going to try and show you the method, sort of the overall method here, and then some of the conclusions that we find for the method. Essentially, for this non-representative but large sample, we find that there are 4 underlying folk theories that describe most people's understanding of social feeds, with Facebook and Twitter having really similar underlying folk theories. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is discover the metaphors that people hold for these different kinds of systems. Then we're going to try and reduce that metaphor space down into some factors using factor analysis to say these are potential candidate factors. And then look at the qualities of those factors to understand what they are. And we're going to use semantic differentials to get at that sort of quality aspect. So the first thing is figuring out how to get people's metaphors. Typical ways of surveying people, we need to know what all the metaphors are and ask people if they agree with it. We wanted to come up with a way that users could tell us what they think. And we used a wiki survey developed by Matt Salganic and Karen Levy. It's really cool. Here's an example of what a user from MTurk would have seen. Which metaphor best captures your understanding of how the Facebook newsfeed selects your content? And then they would read them and they could choose one or the other. But if neither of those really worked for it, they could add their own metaphor. Okay? So they type that in. that metaphor now becomes part of the database, and that metaphor will ultimately be seen by later users and will enter the sort of pairwise dogfight that all the metaphors go through. And so we see all these pairwise battles take place, and then we can calculate what metaphors are the most powerful, what's the ones that people agree with the most. Here's the top 10 metaphors for the two social feeds, Facebook and Twitter. The ones that have asterisks by them are ones that were generated by users. So most of the ones, 7 out of 10 for both of the systems, are metaphors generated by our users and not by the research team. So that's really cool. You can take a look at some examples like magazine, network TV, newspaper. They kind of have this like old media sort of style to them. There's a number of metaphors that are like similar to being an assistant. So we can see that there's like some themes there. And what we want to do is take all the top metaphors and see if we can factor analyze them into some like smaller subset of metaphors. And to do this, we just asked a bunch of other people to say how much they agreed with various kind of statements like newsfeed is like a magazine. You either really don't think that or you really do. And you can ask that for every single metaphor. Once we have that, we can factor analyze all the metaphors we received into some core number of potential folk theories. For Facebook, they factor analyze down to about 4. You can see how they group together here. One is about like personal shopper, butler, bouncer, with some other kind of weirder ones like coin sorter, decision tree. Number 2 is like those old media type things. 3 is sort of like difficult to understand type metaphors. And 4 is like got this negative spying type sense to it. And for Twitter, we see 4 factors as well. And you've got kind of a salad, decision tree, flower picking. It's it's a little bit difficult to make sense of what's going on there. Another one's very mechanistic. This one here also mechanistic, and then this is this sort of like maybe other people helping or not. But it's difficult for us to make sense. So what we want to look at is what are the qualities people associate with these kinds of metaphors. So to do that, we use semantic differentials. And we can basically say, for people that hold this sort of any of these metaphors as the most common thing for Facebook, we can ask all these questions like, well, how do you feel about it? Is this a good thing if this is what the news feed is like? Is this good? And we can use a bunch of these. So we have, for example, do you think the news feed or you think Twitter's feed is useless or useful? Shows me a wide or limited variety of content. Does it depend on what I do, or is it independent of my behavior? How transparent is it? Can I tell like how easily it works? And whose interests are prioritized, mine or other people's or the company's? So the basic idea here is we can say, here's the kind of metaphors you think a news feed or a social feed is like, and then we can ask them, what do you think of the Facebook news feed? And that allows us to understand what the kind of qualities of that factor are. We find, again, that the Twitter and the Facebook factors are really similar. In fact, I'm going to argue today that there's 4 sort of folk theories for social feeds, that we see them in both Twitter and Facebook. The first one we're going to call the rational assistant. The rational assistant had metaphors like, personal assistant as an example, or personal shopper. And it had a very positive evaluation, so people really liked the feed. And they also did not think it prioritized the company. They thought it prioritized them. So this is a really great, if you work at Facebook or Twitter and you find out that people have this sort of folk theory, this is great. This is the kind of folk theory you would imagine you'd want those companies to, their users to have. In contrast, there's a more neutral version. So these are people that, they had a positive evaluation towards the system. They didn't know it was curated at all. And they thought it was quite transparent. These are the people that were really like shocked when they learned, for example, that their newsfeed is manipulated. So this is very neutral in terms of what they think the system's doing, but it's quite a positive folk theory. Then we have what we call the unwanted observer. So these people have a very negative view of the social feeds. They think that it's prioritizing the company. The kind of metaphors we saw here were things like spy and paparazzi. This is a very negative folk theory for how social feeds work. The last one we call the corporate black box. So basically, I don't know how it works, but I think Facebook and Twitter, it's all about them. It's not about me. So it's corporate, and I'm unsure of how it works. So we see these four, and they appear to be similar across the two social feeds. Okay. What we can ask then is, well, how do these feeds stack up on the two? So you can have stronger or weaker beliefs about each system and how strongly you hold the folk theory for each system. So we can then look at how people hold different folk theories for each system. So this is kind of like the average strength of how much you agree with a particular folk theory for the two. Facebook's in black, Twitter is in the gray, and you can see that Twitter outscores Facebook on rational assistant and the transparent platform. And if you're Twitter, this is really good news. Those are pretty positive views. Those are a positive folk theory for a system. Whereas Facebook, the unwanted observer and corporate black box are held more strongly for the Facebook news feed than for Twitter. And this perhaps isn't that surprising. First of all, Facebook, the news feed is much more algorithmically curated than Twitter, although Twitter is as well. But one of the reasons that we use this term folk theory is that we can get outside of just like how it works. That's more a mental model, right? And mental model is like, what do I do and what comes out? Folk theory allows for a much broader understanding. So it's what I think, if Marcus tells me that he really hates, the Facebook thing and that they're stealing things, or if I hear in the news media that, Facebook has created some sort of scandal, all of those inputs for me, whether it's from interpersonal, my own experience with it, or cultural, like the media, they can all influence how I think about this system. And so we see here that Facebook tends to have these more negative kind of folk theories held for it more strongly than the others. Okay, so now that we've developed this method, there's a whole bunch of questions that we can start to ask. I'll just lay out through them real quickly here. So depending on what kind of folk theory you have, does this predict your behavior? And according to folk theories, the literature, it should very much drive behavior. So the way we think about a system, this folk theory, should predict how we treat it, how we interact with it. So if you have a personal shopper folk theory, you should be interacting a lot with the system. The more you give that system, the better it's going to be for you, the more stuff it's going to bring to you, for example. If you have the unwanted observer folk theory, you're going to be a lot more hesitant because it's not doing stuff for you, right? It's taking from you and using it for somebody else. What experiences prompt updates to a folk theory? So if you learned that Facebook manipulated your newsfeed and that violates your expectations of what the newsfeed is, then how does that update? What updating takes place for folk theories? And I think that's continuously being updated as you experience it, interact with it, and hear about it through the media. And then how are folk theories stable across types of algorithms and over time? So do we see similar kinds of folk theories for other systems like online dating? I can tell you already the answer is no. People have very different folk theories for how online dating systems work. What about Siri or OK Google or Alexa? What are our folk theories for what those, super complex engineered things are that we're having social interactions with? We don't know yet. Okay, so I think there's this whole world of trying to understand essentially the psychology of algorithms, but I think algorithms are too narrow. It's about these systems that we use to conduct our social lives with. And I'm working with my student, Megan French, who's on the market this year and is absolutely fantastic, and Mike DeVito and Jeremy Bernholtz at Northwestern to keep working on this project, and this is joint work with all of them. And I thank you all very much for your continued attention all the way through the end of the conference, And thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We have time for questions. 1, 2.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I'm Anxo Sanchez from Madrid. Do you think you could make your theory work in a meta sense? I'm thinking of how social media are working, propagating things like fear of vaccination and things like that, and whether understanding how people think about vaccination and how that's changed by social media could help us prevent these people harming us all?
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, it's a really great question, a very important question. And people in the cognitive science space of folk theory are now working on that very issue. Because as we think about lots of things, from vaccinations to other social issues related to, say, fake news, for example, we know that just telling people, like, hey, vaccinations work, trust us, doesn't work anymore for a subset of the population. And one view is that they hold very different folk theories of, say, how science works, how media works, etc. But we don't know very well yet how those people's folk theories differ from other people's. So you're absolutely right. We're working on a bunch of stuff around trust right now, and why, for example, the Chinese can use WhatsApp to basically do all aspects of their life, massive amounts of trust, even though they don't really trust the government, they don't trust the police, you know. So I think the application of this is very broad, and something like anti-vaxxers where standard cognitive approaches don't work. I think it's a great place to think about. Thank you.
I have a question with regards to the method that you use to generate the folk theories.
Yes.
So as far as I understand, you use like a questionnaire to get at people's like the metaphors that they are using. But is that the way that kind of reproduces your own, like the researchers' assumptions about what people care about? You know, like, is it really something we learn, or is it something we just look into the mirror and, oh, that's what I was thinking about, you know, that's it?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's something that we tried to think a lot about. It's really why we ended up using this platform. So the Wiki survey, and it's a very novel tool, but what it does, I think, is it allows people to provide their own ideas. So it's certainly true that the research team started out by saying, here's 10 metaphors that we think could apply to this. And so we influence it to that degree. That's the mirror part. But as you saw, most of the metaphors that end up being the top metaphors that most of the people in our sample, and this sample was, we had over 40,000 people vote for each system. The top metaphors were not the ones we generated. They tend to be the ones that other users generated. So I think this approach is really valuable for trying to get around that very issue. So I highly recommend the Wiki survey tool. Yeah.
Yes, Scott. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk, and just what great work coming out of the previous work. I'm curious to try to bring this full circle, I guess, and ask, if we'd known these folk theories and the relative sway that they held and such, does it inform us as to what types of experiments we might be able to design, or how we need to change the experimental design in order to still run our successful experiments and much needed experiments, I'll say, but not violate these folk theories?
So that's a great question, and I'd be happy to answer it because this has been really useful for me. So when I think back to the Facebook study, and I started to doubt myself, like, did I miss something, right? Like, I thought carefully about, is this study going to be reasonable? And we had been doing emotional contagion research in the lab for, many studies. In my view, the Facebook emotional contagion study was minimal risk, right? And so one of the few cases for when you don't need informed consent is when you argue that something's minimal risk. And that was my view, and the first good night of sleep I got after this controversy erupted was about 2 weeks later, when there was a paper published in Nature, a letter, where about half of the bioethicists that were asked said, well, no, it seems like you didn't need informed consent for this. The other half thought you would. But at least it was, like, not obvious, right? So what does this folk theory stuff tell you? Well, what I think there is, when I think as a psychologist what minimal risk is, I have one view of it, which is this is no different than other risks they'll face in everyday life. However, what this kind of work tells us is they had no idea that this was a risk they were subject to in everyday life, right? A good number of the population had no idea that they were being manipulated by in this algorithmic way, not only by Facebook, by every social media company. And so my understanding of minimal risk as a psychologist trained in the 90s turns out to have been the wrong assessment of what minimal risk is, because I hadn't thought through what people's folk theories are, get away from the folk theories of just understanding of what the system was. So I misgauged what minimal risk was in terms of perceptions by the users. And I don't think I would have realized that until I'd looked at those emails and then done this research. So yeah, great question, and that's definitely a lesson that I've learned myself. And I think until we know more about how people think about these systems, any experiments or even secondary data analysis we do, unless we understand what people's expectations are with that system, we're going to run into this issue again. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, again.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. Thank you.
And with that, we come to the closing part of this conference. This is the end of this year's IC2S2 2017. I'd like to say a couple of thanks before I let you flee, sort of, the Maternushaus. I'd like to thank you, the attendees, for coming from all over the world, apparently, to Cologne. I was very happy to welcome you here. It was fascinating to see so many of you, the variety of research that was presented today, the intensity of discussions at the posters, the ongoing conversations, of course, at our many different social events, including the boat, which I was very excited about, at least. Thank you for that. It has been awesome having you all here and having you present your research and participate in the conversations. I'd also like to explicitly thank our sponsors again, who have made this event possible and also have helped pay for the boat. Gesis was one of the gold sponsors, and Northwestern. Then we had a silver sponsor by Microsoft and Sage Publishing, and Spring and Nature as a bronze sponsor. Some of the keynote talks were sponsored by these companies and organizations. We also have additional conference friends, and the conference is also supported by the German Science Foundation and a couple of institutional partners, universities, and of course the Socio-Patterns Project, which provided the sensors that you all are wearing, or most of you are wearing. I'd like to thank the entire organizing committee. It has not just been me, it has been really the effort of Dirk Brockman, Nosh Shear, contractor Brian Uzi, Matt Jackson, Helen Margetts, and Duncan Watts to bring all of this together. It's been many Skype conferences over the duration of the last year, and they all have helped to shape the organization, to shape the program, and make the conference what it was. I'd like to thank again our set of exciting speakers that have, at least that was the intention, that brought inspiration in those single format sessions that we had. It was exciting, and it was maybe something that I can share. It was easy in most cases to convince them to come to IC2S2, which I really appreciated as a chair of the conference, right? So that speaks, I think, for the IC2S2 community, that there is really excitement in computational social science and an interest in participating in these events. I'd like to thank the PC co-chairs and the tutorial co-chairs who've invested great effort into organizing the call for abstracts and the call for tutorials. organizing the review, organizing the selection. We've received some feedback with regard to this procedure, and we are relaying this, of course, also to the next year's organizer. We are really taking any kind of feedback that we get in this process serious, and we are trying to improve the processes as a whole. So there was some feedback on whether maybe 3-page abstract is the right format for submitting. Then there was also some questions raised regarding whether the reviewing process and the way we've organized it was the right way. We collected all of these things, and I'll make sure that Nosh next year at least is aware of these voices. And he has already expressed his interest in learning about the experience that we had. So it was, Aaron, Sandra, Brian, Katrin, Jaren, Jürgen, and Derek who really did the lion's share in making sure that the program that you see today is of high quality and that it's of diverse interests and of the quality that you've seen so far. I'd like to thank all of them. Yeah. And then I'd like to thank, of course, the core team of the conference, the logistical experts and the local organizing team, which made this conference possible in the first place. So there is a tendency to assign to the general chairs all the qualities of the conference that one perceives, right? Especially if people come up to me and congratulate me on food or logistics or things, and I had nothing to do with that, right? I was telling the story of how we got the boat, and you have to imagine in German administration hiring a boat. This is an adventure, right? And for me, it was asking Diana whether we can get a boat. And she said, let's do it. And there was nothing more of effort required of me. And it was all effort on the part of those 4 people. And so sort of from the deepest heart, I would like to thank all of them. And I would like to actually ask them to come up to me and... Thank you again. It's been a pleasure working with you on the last year on this event. And as just another anecdote, I've been asked whether they can be hired for future events. You have to talk to them. All right. But there have been even more people involved in the organization of the event. And this is, I think, the complete list, I hope, of the people that all have had some part in running the website, running the socio-pattern study, helping with the technical aspects of the sessions, helping with any other logistical aspects. And I would like just to take the opportunity to, again, thank everybody involved to help run this conference and try to make this as smooth as an event as possible. So with that, I'd like to point you to maybe 1 or 2 other things that might be of interest to you. So some of you might know that GESIS was running the Winter Symposium on Computational Social Science every December for the last 3 years. It was kind of a It was a small event, 100, 200 people. We always went to the Christmas market. It was a similar format than the IC2S2. And what I'm happy to announce is that this symposium is now going to a European level. From this year on, the Winter Symposium will take place in London. It's going to be jointly organized by Helen Margetts from OII and by Luca Aiello from Cambridge Labs. It's taking place, I think, at the Alan Turing Institute, and it's going to have a particular theme, and the theme is going to be inequality and imbalance. And the year after that, the symposium will travel back to Cologne, where we have another theme, which is bias and discrimination in computational social science. And finally, in 2019, the symposium will travel to Zurich, to ETH Zurich, where Frank Schweitzer and David Garcia will organize the event on polarization and radicalization. And this new focus is kind of an experiment. It's the idea that rather than having a general purpose event on computational social science, we're trying to set this specific focus and see whether diverse disciplines and diverse communities come together to tackle our particular social issue. We'll see how that goes. I'm excited about the prospect of it. If you are interested in that, we have these little flyers on each and every seat that summarizes the main information about the symposium, and I'd be happy to, if you would consider presenting your work at these opportunities. There's going to be a call for abstracts and all these things, of course. The event was organized by the Computational Social Science Department at GESIS, and I also want to use the opportunity, of course, to point you to open opportunities at GESIS. If you've been in touch with GESIS at some point, if you are maybe remotely aware of the kind of work that we are doing and you're interested in pursuing a postdoc at GESIS, that's possible right now, please contact anybody from the department and they will point you to the correct information. With that, let me just mention a couple of other things that I've been asked to mention. Please make sure to pick up your poster. There is no way for us to sort of send it back to you. So if you fail to pick up your poster, we have to respectfully dispose it. So please make sure to take it with you. Please also return the sensor. One drawback of these studies is that there is sort of churn, which means that with every study we lose a certain number of sensors, and I would ask for your help to minimize that number for this event. So we have boxes at the entrance, and when you leave the building, please make sure to just drop your badge, including the sensor, in these boxes, and it allows us to run. The problem is even exaggerated because we can't hire the sensors anymore right now, so we really rely on the sensors that we have for now. And I would also like to again mention that our study that is tapping into the sensor data requires also the answers from the surveys. So if you have not done so yet, please, we still have the laptops available. There is still opportunity for you to answer the survey and sort of complete the data. And we would really appreciate it, and it would help us in our study if you would be willing to do that. With that, IC2S2 2017 in Cologne is officially over. We're looking forward to seeing many of you at next year's conference in Evanston. I'm wishing you all a safe journey back home. Enjoy the rest of the day. It has been a pleasure. Bye.